There is a wall beside the Great Sphinx that may remember a sky Egypt no longer has. Not the face of the Sphinx, not the pores, not the famous profile staring across the desert. The real beginning of this investigation is quieter than that. It is a weathered wall of limestone inside the Sphinx enclosure, a carved trench surrounding the monument on the Giza plateau. At first it looks like nothing more than old stone, but then the light changes. When the low sun slides across the western wall, every scar becomes visible. The limestone turns warm and gold in some places, dark and shadowed in others. Long vertical cuts run down the surface. Rounded hollows open in the rock. The wall looks worn, softened, almost melted by time. And once you notice it, the question becomes hard to ignore. Why does a desert monument look as if water once worked on it for a very long time? That is the doorway into Giza's strangest problem. The usual story of the Sphinx is familiar. Ancient Egypt, pharaohs, the 4th dynasty, the Great Pyramid Age. Most archaeologists place the carving of the Sphinx in the reign of Khufu, around the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, more than 4,500 years ago, and that story has real evidence behind it. The Sphinx sits in a royal landscape. Its temples, causeways, quarries, and nearby pyramids fit into the world of Old Kingdom Egypt. But the wall seems to ask a different question. The damage on the enclosure does not look to some geologists like simple desert wind. Windblown sand usually attacks stone from the side. It can cut horizontal grooves, scrape surfaces, and undercut weak layers. But the enclosure walls show something more vertical, more rounded, more like channels made by water running downward from above. If that reading is right, then the stone may be remembering a wetter Giza. Not one storm, not one flood, not a few rare desert rains, but a climate with enough rainfall, over enough time to leave deep marks in the limestone. And that is where the timeline begins to shake. Because the Giza plateau has been dry for a very long time, the Egypt we know, the desert Egypt of pyramids, tombs and windblown sand, is not the kind of place where heavy repeated rainfall should carve a monument like this. So, if the Sphinx enclosure really carries the signature of ancient rain, then we are no longer asking a small question about surface damage. We are asking whether part of Giza may be older than the story usually told about it. That does not mean we throw away Egypt. It does not mean we pretend the pharaohs had nothing to do with Giza. That would be too simple, and honestly too weak. The real question is more interesting. What if Giza is not one story? What if it is a layered place, a monument built, restored, reinterpreted, and inherited across thousands of years? A place where Old Kingdom engineering, sacred memory, geological damage, royal restoration, hidden spaces, and older traditions all overlap in the same stone. That is why this investigation matters. We are not here to repeat the easiest textbook answer, and we're not here to sell a fantasy where every mystery becomes proof of a lost super-civilization. We're going to follow the evidence like a trail. First, the wall, then the accepted archaeological case, then the geological challenge, then the Egyptian texts that speak not only of building, but of restoring, then the silence inside the Great Pyramid, then the modern scans that found unknown spaces hidden in the stone, and later we will widen the map to other ancient places where human beings built with a scale, precision, and memory that still feels almost impossible. The question guiding all of it is simple. Did Egypt create Giza from nothing? Or did Egypt build upon something older, an older sacred landscape, an older memory, an older relationship between stone, sky, water, and power? If this mystery pulls you in, leave a like, subscribe, and write in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It helps turn this investigation into a shared map of people, places, and questions from around the world. Now we can begin properly. Before we chase the anomaly, we have to stand on solid ground. The Sphinx does not sit alone in the desert like a random statue dropped from the sky. It is part of the Giza Plateau, one of the most studied ancient landscapes on Earth. Around it are pyramids, temples, causeways, tombs, quarries, worker areas, and traces of a highly organized royal project. This matters, because any serious mystery has to survive contact with the strongest evidence against it. And the strongest evidence says this: Giza was an Old Kingdom construction landscape. It was not an empty desert. It was not a place later Egyptians simply found untouched. It was a working world of quarrymen, planners, priests, administrators, and labour crews. Inside the Great Pyramid, high above the king's chamber, there are marks left by work gangs in the relieving chambers. These are not polished royal inscriptions made for tourists or temple walls. They are rough marks from the construction process itself, and some of them name Khufu, the pharaoh linked to the Great Pyramid. Then, in 2013, another piece of the puzzle came from far away from Giza, at Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea. Archaeologists found papyri there, among the oldest ever discovered in Egypt. One of them is the diary of an official named Merer, a man responsible for a team of workers. His records describe the transport of fine limestone from Tura to Giza during the time of Khufu. That kind of evidence is powerful because it is ordinary. It is not a myth. It is not a grand temple legend. It is paperwork, logistics, movement of stone, men loading, hauling, delivering, a civilization doing the hard daily work of building. So the question is not whether Egypt belongs at Giza. It does. The real question is whether that is the whole story. A building can have known builders and still inherit older meaning. A cathedral may be built in the Middle Ages on the foundations of a Roman temple, which itself may stand on a place that was sacred long before written records. The cathedral is medieval, its builders are real, but the ground beneath it may carry a much older memory. That is the model we need for Giza, not replacement, inheritance. The pharaohs may have built, shaped, expanded, restored, and claimed the plateau. But the plateau itself, the stone, the horizon, the older sacred geography, the memory of water, the idea of the first land rising from chaos, may have carried meanings older than any single king. This is why the Sphinx enclosure matters so much. It is not just an old wall. It is the point where two languages meet. History speaks in names: Khufu, Khafra, dynasties, work crews, temples, kings. Geology speaks in processes: water, wind, salt, cracks, limestone layers, erosion. And sometimes those two languages do not give the same answer. To understand the question held in the stone, we first have to understand the ground itself. The Sphinx is not separate from the royal landscape around it. It sits beside the causeway and temples of Khafra's pyramid complex, the second Great Pyramid at Giza. That relationship is one of the strongest reasons many Egyptologists connect the Sphinx to Khafre. The standard archaeological model is elegant. Imagine the Giza plateau before the Sphinx was fully shaped. The bedrock is not just empty ground, it is building material. Workers quarry enormous limestone blocks from the plateau floor to build temples and structures nearby. As they cut deeper, they leave a U-shaped trench. In the middle of that trench, they leave a massive natural core of rock. That core becomes the body of the Sphinx. The trench becomes the enclosure. The stone removed from the trench becomes part of the temple complex in front of it. In this model, the Sphinx, the enclosure, and the temple are born together. The monument is not imagined as a statue placed into an older hole. It is a carved form emerging from a quarrying operation, tied directly to the building program of the 4th dynasty. This is not just a guess. Researchers, including teams connected with Ancient Egypt Research Associates and Mark Lehner's work at Giza, have mapped the limestone layers in the enclosure and compared them with the blocks used in the Sphinx temple. The layers match in ways that support the idea that the temple was built from stone quarried out of the enclosure itself. That is a strong case. But strong does not mean complete, because the construction model explains how the monument could have been carved in the Old Kingdom. It explains the relationship between the Sphinx, its enclosure, and the Khafre complex. But it does not fully silence the visual problem on the wall. Construction is one kind of evidence, weathering is another. A block can tell you where it was cut, a tool mark can tell you how it was shaped, a temple plan can tell you how a site was organized, but erosion tells you what happened after a surface was exposed to the world, and that is where the wall becomes dangerous. Because if the surface truly shows long-term rainfall erosion, then it may be remembering exposure under a climate older than the accepted date. If the damage can be explained by salt, moisture, weak limestone, and later weathering, then the Old Kingdom model remains the stronger explanation. So we return to the wall, not as believers, not as debunkers, as investigators. Up close, the Sphinx enclosure does not look evenly worn. Some parts are deeply recessed, some layers are eaten back more than others. Vertical fissures run down from the top. The surface is rounded and rolling, not flat and sharp. It feels less like a wall cut yesterday and more like a natural surface that has endured long, complicated punishment. To make the problem simple, imagine two different forces. The first is desert wind. Wind carries sand. Over time, sand can become like a slow, natural sandblaster. It hits stone from the side, scraping it, cutting it, wearing away weaker layers. In a dry desert, this kind of erosion can create horizontal patterns because the wind moves across the surface. The second force is rain. Rain falls from above. Water runs downward. It follows gravity. It gathers in cracks. It cuts channels. It rounds edges. It can carve vertical paths into the face of stone. Given enough time, enough rainfall, and the right kind of limestone, water can reshape a wall in a way that looks very different from wind erosion. In the early 1990s, the geologist Robert Schoch examined the Sphinx enclosure and argued that the dominant weathering pattern was not caused mainly by wind and sand. He saw it as evidence of precipitation runoff, rainwater moving down the wall over a long period. That conclusion created the famous older Sphinx hypothesis. Because if heavy rainfall carved the enclosure, the Sphinx may have had to stand exposed during a much wetter chapter of North African climate. That could push the original exposure of the monument back before the time of Khafra, perhaps into the African humid period, when parts of the Sahara were greener, wetter, and filled with lakes, animals, and human life. That possibility is the reason this debate refuses to die. It is not just a date change, it is a change in imagination. Suddenly, the Sphinx is not only a royal statue of the Pyramid Age, it becomes a possible survivor from a different Giza, a greener Giza, a wetter Giza, a world before the desert fully took hold. But this is where we have to be careful. A powerful visual argument is not the same thing as proof. Stone can be persuasive. It can make you feel that you are seeing the answer with your own eyes. But stone can also mislead, because different processes can leave similar scars. And the Giza limestone is not simple. It is not one perfect block. It is layered sedimentary rock. Think of it less like solid concrete and more like a stack of different materials pressed together over deep time. Some layers are stronger, some are weaker, some are dense, some are porous, some resist damage, others crumble more easily. This matters because erosion does not attack every layer equally. A weak layer can retreat while a stronger layer remains. A porous layer can absorb moisture. Salt can grow inside the stone. Morning dew, rare rain, groundwater, flash floods, humidity, heat, and wind can all work together over thousands of years. One important process is called heloclasty, but the idea is simple. Water enters the pores of the stone. That water carries dissolved salts. When the water evaporates, salt crystals are left behind. As those crystals grow, they push against the inside of the rock. Slowly, grain by grain, the stone breaks apart from within. It is like the wall is being damaged from the inside out. This process can create rounded, eaten-looking surfaces. Combined with the natural differences between limestone layers, it can produce erosion that looks dramatic without requiring the Sphinx to be many thousands of years older. So the debate is not as simple as wind versus rain. It is not one clean answer, fighting one foolish answer. It is a question of degree. How much of the damage comes from ancient rainfall? How much comes from salt? How much comes from the quality of the limestone? How much from runoff after rare storms? How much from the long exposure of the enclosure after it was carved? How much from restoration, collapse, repair, and recutting across thousands of years? This is why the Sphinx is so powerful as an opening mystery. It does not give us a verdict. It gives us a courtroom. On one side stands the archaeological landscape, Khafra's complex quarrying patterns, temple blocks, Old Kingdom context. On the other side stands the weathered wall, vertical channels, rounded hollows, water-like scars, and the memory of a wetter world. Between them is the question that pulls us forward. Can both be true in some way? Could the Sphinx belong to the Old Kingdom as a monument, while also preserving older sacred meaning, older weathering history, or older landscape memory? Could Giza be less like a single construction project, and more like a sacred place rewritten many times? That is the deeper mystery. Not simply who built it, but what did the builders think they were building upon? And what did later Egyptians believe they had inherited? This brings us from stone to text. Because the Sphinx did not only weather in silence. For thousands of years, Egyptians returned to it, cleared it, honoured it, restored it, and placed stories around it. If the stone gives us one kind of memory, the inscriptions give us another. The most famous of these stands between the paws of the Sphinx. It is the Dream Stela, a massive granite slab erected by Thutmose IV of the 18th dynasty, more than 1,000 years after the age usually assigned to Khafra. It does not come from the time of the pyramid builders, it is much later, but that is exactly what makes it fascinating. Because by the time Thutmose encountered the Sphinx, the monument was already ancient. The story carved on the stela tells us that Thutmose, before he became king, went hunting in the desert. Tired, he rested in the shadow of the Sphinx. At that time, the body of the monument was partly buried in sand. The head may have risen above the desert like a forgotten god half swallowed by time. Then he dreamed. In the dream, the Sphinx spoke to him. It identified itself with a powerful solar form and complained that sand was covering its body. The great being made a promise. Clear me, restore me, and you will become king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Thutmose woke, cleared the sand, restored the monument, and eventually became pharaoh. Now this text must be handled honestly. The Dream Stela does not prove that the Sphinx is prehistoric. It does not prove that Khafra found it already standing. It is a royal story, a sacred political message. It presents Thutmose as chosen by divine power. It gives his rule cosmic legitimacy. But the image at its heart is still extraordinary. A future king of Egypt meets the Sphinx not as a new monument but as an ancient presence buried by time, a sleeping power, a god in the sand, something not simply built but rediscovered. That matters, because it shows how later Egyptians themselves could experience Giza, not merely as architecture, but as inheritance, a place where the past was already deep, a place where monuments had to be restored, reawakened, and brought back into the light. This does not settle the age of the Sphinx, but it changes the feeling of the question. Giza was never just stone. It was memory. It was kingship. It was sacred ground. It was a landscape where later rulers could gain power by touching something older than themselves. And that brings us to the next problem. The Dream Stela shows us a king from a later age restoring the Sphinx as an ancient sacred presence. But is there any text, however fragile, that brings this idea of inheritance closer to the time of the pyramid builders themselves? The Dream Stela shows us a king from a later dynasty, engaging with the Sphinx as a sacred ancient being he must restore. But there is another, more charged piece of stone that takes this idea of inheritance even further. It's called the Inventory Stela. Found at Giza in the 19th century, it's a text that seems to speak directly from the time of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid. And its words are astonishing. The stela describes Khufu finding the temple of Isis, mistress of the pyramid, already in a state of disrepair. It speaks of his decision to build his own pyramid beside this ancient temple, and it explicitly mentions the Sphinx, not as something Khufu created, but as a monument already present, a neighbour to the sacred structures he was restoring. On the surface, this text appears to be a stunning admission. It's a document that seems to solve the entire puzzle in a single stroke, placing the 4th dynasty pharaoh not as the originator of the sacred landscape, but as an inheritor and a restorer. For those who see a deeper timeline at Giza, this stela is a centerpiece of evidence, but with ancient texts, the story is rarely so simple. Imagine finding a beautifully printed book in a modern library, written today, that tells a detailed story about Abraham Lincoln. The book is about him, but it is not from his time. The paper, the ink, the style of the language all belong to our world, not his. The inventory. Stela presents a similar problem. While the story it tells is set in the time of Khufu, Egyptologists who have studied the stone itself, the style of its carving, the grammar of its hieroglyphs, have concluded that it was not made in the 4th dynasty. It was likely created much, much later, during the 26th dynasty, nearly 2,000 years after Khufu lived. This fact changes everything. The stela can no longer be seen as a direct contemporary report from Khufu's era. Instead, it becomes a paradox. Is it simply a work of religious fiction, created by priests in a later age to give their temple an ancient and venerable history? Or is it something more? Could it be the written version of a sacred tradition, an oral history passed down through generations of priests that preserved a genuine memory of Giza's landscape before the Great Pyramids were built? We cannot say for certain. The stela is not the hard proof some wish it to be. but to dismiss it entirely might also be a mistake. It remains a fascinating echo, a testament to the idea that even for Egyptians living millennia after Khufu, Giza was a place of deep memory, a landscape that was found as much as it was made. The texts whisper of restoration and inheritance, but their voices are layered and distant. To continue the investigation, we must turn from these ambiguous words and go to the largest object on the plateau. We must go inside the Great Pyramid itself and listen to the silence of the stone. The texts, whether clear or contested, open a door to the idea of inheritance. But the most powerful statement Giza makes is not written on papyrus or granite stele. It is built into the landscape itself. To continue the investigation, we have to leave the sunlight and the desert air and enter the heart of the great monument to Khufu. The experience of moving through the Great Pyramid is one of compression and release. You enter through narrow, ascending passages, the immense weight of millions of tons of limestone a felt presence above you. The air is still and cool. There is a sense of travelling not just into stone, but into a different order of time. Our modern imagination of an Egyptian tomb is shaped by the treasures of later pharaohs, especially Tutankhamun. We expect walls covered in a vibrant universe of gods and spells, golden shrines, and a nested series of coffins protecting the royal mummy. We expect the story of the king's journey to the afterlife to be written everywhere. But inside the Great Pyramid, what you encounter is a profound and unsettling silence. There are no carved hieroglyphs on the passage walls, no paintings of funerary processions. The so-called Queen's Chamber is a stark, gabled room of limestone, empty save for its own austere geometry. Far below, a subterranean chamber is carved from the bedrock, seemingly unfinished. And at the heart of the structure, at the top of the magnificent Grand Gallery, the King's Chamber is a precise box of red granite. Inside it sits a single object, a large, lidless granite coffer, damaged at one corner. This silence is the source of a central and persistent question. Why would the most ambitious construction project on the planet, the eternal resting place for a divine king, be so utterly devoid of the religious texts and imagery that fill later tombs? Why this monumental quiet? This is a powerful question, but it must be met with two equally powerful facts. First, the funerary customs of the Old Kingdom were not the same as those of the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years later. The expectation of walls covered in texts is an assumption based on a different era. Second, the looting of ancient tombs is not a modern phenomenon. It began in antiquity itself. An empty sarcophagus is, sadly, the historical norm, not the exception. The absence of a body proves very little on its own, and we know from the quarry marks found in the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber that work gangs invoked Khufu's name during its construction. So, the empty coffer does not disprove that the pyramid was intended as a tomb, but the building's stark interior, its unique shafts, and its mathematical strangeness have kept the question of its full purpose alive. The silence may not be a verdict, but it creates a space for inquiry. If the function cannot be settled by what was left inside, perhaps it can be understood by looking at the form of the structure itself. The silence of the Great Pyramid's interior cannot by itself decide what the structure was for. But if the function remains a question, the form speaks more clearly. When we step back from the monument, its physical shape and placement on the earth reveal a level of precision that is, in itself, a profound statement. The Great Pyramid is not oriented casually. Its four faces are aligned to the cardinal directions, north, south, east and west, with an accuracy that is startling. We are not speaking of magnetic north, the wandering point to which a simple compass points. We mean true north, the fixed, astronomical concept of the planet's axis of rotation. To find this point and align a monument of this scale to it, with an error of only a few arc minutes, requires sophisticated observation of the heavens and a deep understanding of geometry. It is a feat that would challenge engineers today. This precision has invited a closer look. For generations, observers have measured the pyramid's proportions, looking for a message in its design, and they have found patterns. Some analyses suggest that the pyramid's core ratios, the relationship between its height and the perimeter of its base, contain a close approximation of the mathematical constant pi. Others point to proportions that seem to reflect the golden ratio, phi. The small, mysterious shafts leading out from the King's and Queen's chambers have been interpreted as alignment channels, pointing towards specific stars or constellations as they would have appeared in the sky thousands of years ago. The precision of the alignment is a fact on the ground. The mathematical relationships are also real, in that they can be calculated from the building's dimensions. But this raises a crucial question, one that sits at the heart of many ancient mysteries: the difference between correlation and intention. A pattern can be mathematically true without being an intentional message. A spider's web is full of exquisite geometry, but the spider does not intend to encode a mathematical treatise. Did the pyramid's builders deliberately encode these constants as a lasting archive of knowledge? Or are these values the natural, elegant byproduct of a sacred geometry, a system of design where harmony was the goal, and these ratios simply came along as part of that harmony? We do not have to decide that the pyramid is a supercomputer in stone to feel the weight of this knowledge. The awe comes not from proving a secret code, but from recognizing a profound and deliberate order. The builders, whoever they were not simply piling up a mound of rock. They were mapping the cosmos onto the desert floor, creating a structure that was in dialogue with the stars and with the very shape of the earth. The pyramid's design is an act of supreme confidence, an announcement that the order of the world can be understood, measured, and replicated in stone. The geometry of what we can see and measure carries these deep questions about the minds of its creators. But in recent years, our ability to see has changed. We are no longer limited to the surfaces and passages known to antiquity. The next question is not what the pyramid's form tells us, but what our most advanced modern tools are revealing about the spaces hidden inside. For centuries, the Great Pyramid seemed to be a known quantity. Its passages mapped, its chambers measured, its stones counted. The age of great discovery at Giza, many assumed, was over. But in 2017, a team of international researchers announced something that changed the map of the pyramid's interior. Using technology that did not exist a generation ago, the Scan Pyramids project found a ghost inside the machine. A vast, previously unknown void sealed within the core of the monument since its construction. To find it, they didn't drill or excavate, they simply listened to the sky. The method is called muon radiography, and it works like a colossal natural X-ray. Earth is constantly showered by high-energy particles called muons, generated when cosmic rays strike the upper atmosphere. This particle rain passes through almost everything, through the air, through our bodies, and through stone. But just as bones stop more X-rays than skin does, dense stone stops more muons than empty air does. By placing highly sensitive detectors inside and around the pyramid, researchers could track the paths of millions of these particles. Where more muons arrived at the detectors, the material they passed through was less dense. It was a way to see the shadows cast inside the pyramid's stone, a form of non-destructive archaeology that allows the monument to keep its secrets and its structural integrity. And the shadow they found was immense, located directly above the magnificent Grand Gallery. The space they named the Scan Pyramid's Big Void is at least 30 meters long. Its scale is comparable to the gallery that lies beneath it. This was not a minor crack or a construction flaw. To ensure the signal was real, 3 separate research teams from France and Japan used 3 different muon detection techniques. All 3 teams confirmed the void's existence independently. This is not a theory or an interpretation. It is a peer-reviewed, scientifically confirmed structural feature of the Great Pyramid. But to detect a space is not the same as to understand its purpose. Its function remains completely unknown. It could be an intentional part of the design, perhaps a chamber to relieve the immense weight of the masonry above the Grand Gallery, similar to the small relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. It might be an internal ramp used during construction and then sealed. Or it could be something else entirely, a space whose purpose we cannot yet guess. The science can tell us with very high confidence that it is there. It cannot yet tell us why. What this discovery proves, beyond any doubt, is that the Great Pyramid is not a closed book. It is not a static relic whose every detail has been accounted for. It remains an active site of discovery, a place that can still reveal fundamental new features 4,500 years after it was built. The wonder it inspires is not just for the ancient past, but for a present where we can still listen to the heart of the stone. This immense void is deep within the monument, inaccessible. But another, more recent discovery would find a smaller corridor, much closer to the surface, raising an entirely different kind of question. Once you find a new door, do you open it? The discovery of the Big Void was not the only finding of the Scan Pyramids project. Another, smaller signal pointed to a corridor-shaped structure about 9 meters long, located behind the monument's north face, near an area known as the Chevron entrance. While the Big Void was a vast, inaccessible shadow, this new feature felt closer, more tangible. It raised an immediate practical question. How do you look inside a space like that without doing harm? In medicine, there is a core principle that governs every action. First, do no harm. An intervention is weighed against the risk of making things worse. For a World Heritage Site like the Great Pyramid, the same ethic applies, but on a scale of millennia. There is only one. Any damage done in the name of discovery is permanent. There is no second chance. So, the investigation of the North Face corridor became a model of this new patient archaeology. Instead of drills and hammers, the team used the most delicate tools available. They identified a tiny gap between the stones of the chevron, a joint in the original masonry. Through this small opening, they were able to introduce an endoscopic camera, a probe no thicker than a pencil to peer into the void. The images that came back confirmed what the muon scans had suggested: an empty corridor-like space with a vaulted ceiling, hidden within the pyramid's mass since its construction. This process, slow and deliberate, shows a profound respect for the monument. It treats the pyramid not as a code to be cracked or a treasure box to be broken open, but as an irreplaceable artifact that must be preserved for all future generations. And this reveals the true tension at Giza. It is not, as is sometimes suggested, a simple conflict between secretive authorities and bold truth seekers. It is a much more difficult and more interesting ethical dilemma. It is the friction between our intense human desire to know what lies behind the next wall and our absolute duty to protect what we have inherited. Caution in this context can easily look like secrecy, but the deeper question is one of responsibility. The fact remains that even after centuries of study, the most famous monument on Earth still contains unmapped spaces. It is still, structurally, an open question. This realization pushes our investigation outward. If Giza can still hold such fundamental surprises, then it forces us to ask, just how old and how complex can monumental architecture be elsewhere in the world? If the questions at Giza still contain spaces we cannot enter, perhaps the next step is to leave the plateau entirely, to move not just in space, but deep into time, to a place that asks a different but related question. How old is the human impulse to organize the world with monumental stone? In the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, a site has emerged from the earth that quietly changed the story of the human past. It is called Göbekli Tepe. What we see there are not pyramids, but circles of immense T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall. They are elegant, stylized, and carved with intricate reliefs of animals: foxes, boars, cranes, and serpents. For a long time, the established model of human history followed a simple, logical progression. First came the agricultural revolution. Then, with food surpluses, came permanent villages, which grew into cities. Only then, with complex social structures and specialized labor, did monumental architecture become possible. It was a neat, linear story. Göbekli Tepe shows that this story is incomplete. The site's age, confirmed through decades of careful archaeology, is staggering. Its earliest layers date to the 10th to 9th millennia BC. This means its builders began their work more than 11,000 years ago, making it some 6,000 years older than the first standing stones at Stonehenge and 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid. The people who raised these pillars were not farmers in a settled city. They were hunter-gatherers, moving through a world just emerging from the last ice age. They had not yet developed pottery or domesticated wheat on a mass scale. According to the old timeline, they should not have been capable of this kind of vast, coordinated, and symbolically rich construction. And yet, they were. This discovery is a fundamental fracture in the simple timeline of human progress. It proves that the capacity for large-scale ritual, social organization, and monumental building is a profoundly ancient part of the human story. But it is essential to be precise about what this means for our investigation. Göbekli Tepe is not evidence of a single lost global civilization that built everything. Its art, its purpose, its form are unique to its time and place in ancient Anatolia. There is no direct link, no architectural thread, that connects these pillars to the passages of the Great Pyramid. Its true importance is more profound. It proves that the human imagination was already working with deep symbolism and organizing itself into complex projects many thousands of years before the time of the pharaohs. It widens the entire field of possibility for what our ancestors were capable of. It doesn't solve the mystery of Giza, but it changes the room in which the questions are asked. It tells us that by the time the first stones were being laid on the Giza plateau, humanity had already been dreaming in stone for a very, very long time. If Göbekli Tepe recalibrates our sense of time and organization, another site confronts us with a different kind of challenge, one that pushes our understanding of sheer physical scale. If the ruins of Göbekli Tepe present a question of immense age, other sites confront us with a challenge of impossible scale. We leave the Anatolian highlands and travel to Lebanon to the Bekaa Valley. Here, on a site that has been sacred for millennia, stands the ancient complex of Baalbek. In Roman times, it was known as Heliopolis, the city of the sun, and it was home to one of a truly colossal sanctuary. The temples themselves are magnificent ruins, but it is their foundation that stops the mind. The podium on which the great temple of Jupiter was built is made of some of the largest worked stones on the planet. 3 of them, laid side by side in one course of the western retaining wall, are known as the trilithon. Each of these blocks is a precisely cut monolith of limestone, estimated to weigh around 800 tons. To give that number a physical meaning, one of these stones weighs more than 3 of the largest passenger jets combined. Or imagine a stack of more than 500 cars compressed into a single, rectangular block of limestone, and there are 3 of them, lifted high into the air and fitted together with uncanny precision. In the nearby quarry, another, even larger stone lies unfinished. It is known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, and it weighs over 1,000 tons. The presence of these stones creates a profound and legitimate question of engineering. The sheer ambition is overwhelming. This is where the human mind naturally turns to ideas of a forgotten technology, of a lost science of construction. The scale feels so far beyond the expected capacity of the ancient world that it seems to demand an extraordinary explanation. It is this feeling, this gap between what we see and what we believe was possible, that makes Baalbek a cornerstone for theories of a much older, highly advanced civilization. And yet, this is where the layers of evidence become crucial. The archaeological and historical context for this monumental platform is well established. This podium was the foundation for the Roman Temple of Jupiter, an immense project of imperial architecture from the 1st centuries AD. The Romans, inheriting a site that was already sacred to local deities, sought to build something that would project the power and piety of their empire across the known world. This doesn't erase the awe, it gives it a home. The stunning achievement of quarrying, transporting and lifting the trilithon belongs to the engineers of the Roman era. Their methods are still debated, but the context is not. Baalbek teaches us a vital lesson for this investigation. We can, and should, stand in absolute wonder at the scale of an ancient achievement without needing to detach it from the people who created it. The reality of what the Romans accomplished here is, by itself, enough to humble our modern assumptions. The challenge of Baalbek is one of brute force, of incomprehensible weight. But other sites pose a different kind of question, one that shifts from scale to precision. For this, our journey takes us across the world, to a high-altitude plateau in the Andes, to a scattered and enigmatic ruin known as Puma Punku. From the monumental weight of Baalbek, we travel across the world and up into the thin, clear air of the Andes. Here, on a high plateau in modern Bolivia, nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, lies a landscape that seems to defy logic. This is Puma Punku. At first glance, it is a scene of profound chaos. Enormous, finely worked blocks of andesite and red sandstone are scattered across the plain, as if a giant's workshop of impossibly complex components was smashed to pieces. The most famous of these are the H-blocks, stones carved with such precision that they appear almost modular, like parts from a kit. They lie overturned, fragmented, their clean lines and sharp internal corners a stark contrast to the rugged landscape around them. It is like coming across the wreckage of an intricate clock, or a grand piano shattered into its component parts. You can see the original complexity in the pieces, but the logic of their assembly is lost. For decades, the mystery of Puma Punku focused on these individual stones. The precision of the cuts and the interlocking designs invited speculation, But this tight focus on the scattered blocks was like trying to understand a forest by looking at a single fallen leaf. Recent surveys, using technologies that can see beneath the surface of the Earth, have revealed something extraordinary. The chaos is an illusion, or rather, it is only the surface layer. Beneath the grass, drone-based imaging has uncovered the faint outlines of a vast and highly organized ceremonial landscape. The visible ruins of Pumapunku are not an isolated wonder. They are part of a much larger complex connected to the great center of Tiwanaku. There are buried platforms, foundational structures, and a network of canals, irrigation ditches, and roads that organize this entire sacred space. The scattered stones were not random. They were components within a city-scale machine for ritual and civic life, built by the indigenous peoples of the Tiwanaku culture, which flourished here for centuries before the rise of the Inca. The real mystery of Pumapunku, then, is not one of the impossible technology. It is a mystery of scale. What we see on the surface is merely the exposed, broken edge of a far greater world. It is a powerful reminder that the archaeological record is not a complete map of the past. It is a collection of islands, the parts that, by chance, have remained visible above the surface. The rest of the continent, the true shape of that ancient world, often lies just out of sight. Pumapunku shows us how much can be hidden by a thin layer of soil and time. This raises another question. If so much can be lost by accident, what might be preserved when a world is constructed underground by design? On the island of Malta, a short distance from the Mediterranean coast, there is an entrance that leads not up but down. It begins as a simple opening in the limestone, but it descends into a world carved from the living rock. A vast 3-level sanctuary of curving chambers, false doorways, and silent halls. This is the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, a United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization World Heritage Site. It is not architecture in the way we usually understand it. It is not a structure built of separate stones. It is an inverted pyramid, a cathedral of absence, excavated from the Earth's memory between 4000 and 2500 BC. For over 1,000 years, this subterranean world served as a necropolis, a collective tomb. The remains of an estimated 7,000 individuals were brought down into its quiet, sculpted chambers. The builders, using only flint and obsidian tools, painstakingly carved the limestone to imitate the temples that once stood on the surface. You can see the echoes of post and lintel doorways, of corbelled ceilings all rendered in the solid rock. Faint traces of ochre paint, spirals and geometric patterns still cling to the walls, the last vestiges of rituals performed in the deep, resonant quiet. It is a place that feels both immense and intimate, a city for the dead designed to last for an eternity. And in a way, it did. The Hypogeum is one of the most astonishingly well-preserved monuments from the Neolithic world. Unlike the stone circles and temples on the surface, which have been weathered by millennia of sun and wind, this underground world was sealed and forgotten for thousands of years, a time capsule protected by the very earth from which it was carved. Its survival is the key. It persisted not by chance, but because it was hidden. It was insulated from the forces that erase history. The scouring wind and rain, the cycle of freezing and thawing, the endless hunger of new civilizations recycling old stones for new walls. It escaped the entropy that consumes everything on the surface. This one site provides a profound lesson in what we might call preservation bias. The archaeological record is not a fair or complete library of the past. It is a scattered collection of the few pages that happened to survive the fire. Our view of antiquity is dramatically skewed toward things that were lucky. It favours stone over wood, fired pottery over woven baskets, metal tools over leather straps. It favours dry deserts, where preservation is exceptional, over wet jungles or temperate coastlines, where organic material vanishes almost without a trace. It remembers what was buried and forgets what was left exposed. The map of the ancient world we can draw is not a map of where people lived, but a map of where the evidence managed to survive. The Hypogeum survived because it was entombed. It is a world saved by burial. This raises a critical question for our entire investigation. If the ground can act as a preserver, what is the great force of erasure? What mechanism doesn't just let history decay, but actively removes entire landscapes from the map, ensuring that whatever was there is lost to us, perhaps forever? The monuments that survive, whether on the surface or buried underground, are the exceptions. They are the fortunate few that escape the single greatest process of erasure in recent geological history. And it begins with a simple, staggering number. Since the peak of the last ice age, around 21,000 years ago, the average global sea level has risen by approximately 120 meters. To make that number feel real, picture a 40-story building. Now, imagine the ocean rising from its ground floor to its roof. That is the scale of the change. That is the volume of water that returned to the world's oceans as the continental ice sheets melted. What this means is that for the vast majority of our species' time on Earth, the world did not look the way it does on our maps. The coastlines we take for granted are a geologically recent invention. Where we now see open sea, there were once vast, low-lying coastal plains. The continental shelves, those gentle slopes that extend out from the land before dropping into the deep ocean, were not submerged. They were dry land. These lost landscapes were not barren frontiers. They would have been among the most desirable places to live on the planet. They were the downstream ends of entire continents, rich with the life that gathers where great rivers meet the sea. Wide estuaries, sprawling marshes, and temperate coastal woodlands would have offered an abundance of resources far greater than most inland environments. This is precisely where we would expect to find human communities flourishing. This is not a contested or speculative theory. It is a fundamental reality of our planet's climate history, confirmed by decades of research in geology and oceanography. The evidence is drilled from ice cores in Antarctica and scraped from sediments on the ocean floor. And so, the most common and reasonable objection to a deeper human story, the simple question, if there were older cultures, where are their remains, is met with an equally simple and powerful answer. For any that lived near the coasts, their remains are likely under 120 meters of water, and buried beneath thousands of years of accumulated silt and marine sediment. The absence of evidence is not, in this case, evidence of absence. It is the predictable result of a planetary transformation. This single process, the great rising of the waters, is the largest mechanism of forgetting we know. It provides a rational, non-conspiratorial reason why the archaeological record of early humanity might be profoundly, fundamentally incomplete. But this immense rise was not always a slow, steady, imperceptible creep. At certain times within that long melting it was catastrophically fast. Но это долгое, медленное таяние не было равномерным. В геологической летописи есть моменты, когда процесс резко ускорялся. Один из таких периодов, известный как импульс талой воды 1А, произошел примерно 14 650 лет назад. В течение менее чем 500 лет уровень Мирового океана поднялся примерно на 20 метров. 500 лет – это долгий срок. Но 20 метров – это огромное изменение. Чтобы это представить, нужно перестать мыслить геологическими эпохами и перейти к человеческому масштабу. Это не голливудский потоп, не одна гигантская волна, стирающая континент за один день. Это было нечто более медленное, но, возможно, более ужасающее. Это была катастрофа, разворачивающаяся на протяжении жизни нескольких поколений. Представьте, что вы живете в прибрежной деревне. За свою жизнь вы видите, как море неумолимо приближается, забирая каждый год несколько метров земли. Береговая линия, на которой играли ваши деды, теперь находится под водой. Плодородные низменности, где вы охотились или собирали пищу, превратились в соленые болота. Священные места, отмеченные камнями вашими предками, исчезли под волнами. Это не внезапная смерть, а медленное удушение мира. Вы вынуждены уходить вглубь суши, ваши дети рождаются как беженцы, а истории, которые вы рассказываете, это истории о потерянном доме, поглощенном водой. Эта картина вот не вымысел, это реальные последствия, с которыми столкнулись бы прибрежные народы в период такого быстрого подъема уровня моря. Они теряли не просто землю, они теряли свой мир, свою историю, свои кладбища. И здесь возникает глубокий вопрос. Когда травма настолько велика и затрагивает так много поколений, может ли память о ней пережить цивилизации, которые ее испытали? Могут ли эти события, передаваясь из уст в уста на протяжении тысяч лет, стать основой для историй, которые мы находим по всему миру? Истории о Великом потопе, который очистил Землю и заставил человечество начать все сначала. Это не доказывает, что какая-то конкретная история о потопе является точным историческим отчетом, но это дает мощный реальный якорь. Это предполагает, что эти мифы могут быть не просто выдумками или моральными притчами. Они могут быть тем, что мы могли бы назвать культурной памятью, далеким, искаженным эхом подлинной геологической травмы, пережитой нашими далекими предками. И если этот опыт потери и нового начала через воду так глубоко запечатлелся в человеческой памяти по всему миру, то как культура, рожденная и вскормленная самой могущественной рекой на планете, представляла себе самое начало времен? The physical world of water is not the only place where memory of a great change might be kept. There is another archive, one made of story, symbol, and ritual, an archive that can hold the memory of a process for thousands of years, even after the original event has faded from living recollection. In the foundational stories of ancient Egypt, the world does not begin with light or sound, but with water, a vast, dark, silent, and limitless ocean of possibility called Nu. Out of these primordial waters, the first act of creation was the emergence of the first piece of dry land, a solitary mound rising from the chaos, providing the first solid place for life and order to begin. This was the primeval mound, sometimes known as the Ben-Ben. It was the stage upon which the creator god appeared, and from which all of creation unfolded. This was not just an abstract idea. For the ancient Egyptians, this was a lived reality, repeated every single year. The life of their entire civilization depended on the annual inundation of the Nile River. Each year the waters would rise, flooding the valley, and when they receded they left behind a layer of rich, black, fertile silt. This was Kemet, the Black Land. Every year they witnessed the world being reborn from the waters. The first mounds of earth to reappear as the flood withdrew were potent symbols of this eternal cycle of renewal. Creation wasn't a single event in the distant past. It was a process they participated in. This symbol of the first land, the Ben-Ben, became the central organizing principle of their most sacred architecture. A temple was not just a building. It was a model of the cosmos, a recreation of the world at the moment of its birth. Its floor would gradually rise from the entrance to the inner sanctuary, mirroring the primeval mound. And the most powerful expression of this idea was the pyramid itself. The pyramid is a geometric representation of that first mound of creation, a stairway to the heavens, yes, but also a monument to the emergence of order from the watery chaos. The capstone of a great pyramid or an obelisk was called the Ben-Benet, a miniature Ben-Ben completing the symbol. This is the foundational story of the Egyptian world. But what if a story this powerful can hold more than one layer of memory at once? The myth of the primeval mound perfectly describes the annual life-giving Nile flood. But could a story about a world beginning with the retreat of a vast and chaotic water also serve as a vessel for a far deeper, older memory? A cultural echo of a time when the entire world, not just the Nile Valley, was being reshaped by rising seas. This is not to say the myth is a geological report of Meltwater Pulse 1a, it is not. But it raises a profound question about how cultures process and preserve the memory of world-altering change. To consider this possibility is not to dismiss the Egyptian worldview. It is to suggest that its roots may run even deeper than we imagine, holding within its most sacred symbols the memory of both a season and an age. With these layers of evidence now in place, the stone, the texts, the hidden spaces, the geology, and the myth, we can step back and propose a way to see Giza that holds all of these pieces together without forcing us to choose between them. Within the layered memory of ancient Egypt, there is a recurring idea, a name for a time before time, Zep Tepi, the first time. This was not a historical date on a calendar. It was a concept more akin to a mythical dream time, an epoch of creation when the patterns of the world were set down in their first and most perfect form. It was the age when the gods walked the earth, when order was established from chaos, and when the first dry land, the primeval mound, emerged from the dark, limitless waters. For the Egyptian mind, history was not a line of endless progress, but a constant effort to maintain, defend, and reconnect with the perfection of that original moment. Seen through this lens, the act of building a great monument becomes something more than a construction project. It becomes a ritual. Every quarry cut, every stone set with celestial precision, every geometric form laid out upon the desert floor could be understood as an act of cosmic maintenance. It was a way to make the world of Zep Tepi physically present again, to build a small island of eternal order in the midst of a world that was always decaying toward chaos. The shape of the pyramid itself echoes that first mound of creation. The Ben-Ben, making the monument a machine for recreating the world's beginning. This is a profoundly Egyptian way of seeing a monument. It is not an idea imported from outside, but one that grows from the very soil of their worldview. So, what if the Great Pyramid is not an either/or question? What if it is not simply a tomb, but also a device for restoring the first time? This perspective allows the monument to be a masterpiece of Old Kingdom engineering, built by Egyptian hands, while also serving as a vessel for their deepest and perhaps most ancient ideas about origins, water, and order. It respects the worldview of the builders, inviting us to see the stone not just as a royal burial place, but as a prayer made solid. This understanding, where an object can be built in one age while embodying the memory of a much older idea, provides the final piece we need to assemble a more complete model of Giza's mystery. For much of our journey, the questions surrounding Giza have been framed as a stark and unforgiving choice. Either the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom, in the time of Khufu and Khafre, conceived of and built these monuments from a cultural ground zero, or they did not. They simply found them, a legacy left by a much older, lost civilization. It is a debate that forces us into opposing camps, where one story must replace the other entirely. But what if this is a false choice? What if the monuments are not a single statement, but a conversation across millennia? Consider a great medieval cathedral. The masons who built it in the 12th century are historical fact. We have their guild records, their tool marks on the stone, the names of their patrons. They are the builders. And yet, the ground on which the cathedral stands was likely sacred for centuries, perhaps millennia, before they arrived. The building's orientation toward the east follows a tradition far older than its own walls. The geometry encoded in its floor plan, the ratio of nave to apse, carries a symbolic language inherited from Roman architects, from Greek philosophers, from traditions that stretch back into an unwritten past. The cathedral is medieval, but it is also a vessel for a much deeper memory. It is a work of inheritance, not just invention. This is the inheritance model, and it allows us to look at Giza without erasing anyone. It suggests that the people of the Old Kingdom were the builders, their hands and tools, their logistics recorded in papyri, their work gangs named in red paint inside the Great Pyramid. This is the physical reality of construction in the 3rd millennium BC. But it also suggests they were building within a tradition, on a landscape that already possessed a profound sacred power. They may have inherited the location itself, a high point on the west bank of the Nile already associated with the primeval mound of creation. They may have inherited the alignments, a celestial geometry passed down through generations of observation. They inherited a cultural memory, a story of a first time that could be reenacted and solidified in stone. In this view, the Egyptians are not merely copying a blueprint. They are the master architects of their age, giving new form to the most ancient and powerful ideas they possessed. The weathering on the Sphinx enclosure, the restoration story of the Dream Stela, the deep mythology of water and land, none of these have to replace the Old Kingdom. They become the sacred ground upon which the Old Kingdom built. This is a more complex story. It does not offer the simple satisfaction of a single, secret answer. But it is also more resilient. It honors the skill and ambition of the dynastic Egyptians, while also making a respectful space for the possibility of a much deeper cultural memory. The real mystery of Giza, then, may not be a question of replacement at all. It may be a story of inheritance. To see how this pattern of a deep past, underestimated and inherited, is not unique to one place, we must now leave the sands of Egypt. We will travel to another continent, to a landscape whose own ancient story has been, until very recently, almost entirely invisible. To test the inheritance model, to feel its true weight, we have to leave Giza for a moment. We have to travel from the old world to the new, and from stone monuments that reach for the sky to traces left in the earth. Our evidence is no longer a temple wall or a granite sarcophagus. It is a footprint, preserved in the ancient dried mud of a long-vanished lake bed in what is now New Mexico. These are the white sands footprints. They are not artifacts. They are not tools or buildings. They are frozen moments of life. Here, a woman walks, her feet sinking slightly into the wet ground. There, a child's track appears inside an adult's, a sign of being carried. In another place, the prints of a giant ground sloth run parallel to human tracks, telling a story of a hunt, or of a careful coexistence on the edge of the ice. This is not the memory of a king, encoded in stone. It is the memory of a body, written by its own weight and motion. For decades, the story of human arrival in the Americas had a firm boundary, a wall in time around 13,000 years ago. But these footprints dissolve that wall. Multiple lines of evidence, from radiocarbon dating of embedded seeds to geological analysis, converge on a stunning conclusion. These tracks were made between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. People, the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, were walking this land during the last glacial maximum, the deepest point of the last ice age. This is not a monument, but it is an immovable anchor for a deeper American time, and it is vital to understand what these footprints prove and what they do not. They offer no evidence of an advanced technological civilization. That is not their purpose. Their power is in their simplicity. They prove that the story of humanity on this continent is thousands of years older than the textbooks told us. They prove that long before the pyramids of Giza were ever conceived, people were living, hunting, and raising their children on a landscape we had mistakenly believed was empty. A single footfall can be a more profound revision of history than the collapse of an empire. And if people were here this early, living through the slow end of an ice age, it raises a new question. What kinds of complex societies did their descendants build, and how much of that record have we also underestimated? A single human footprint preserved in the mud of an ancient lake can change the story of a continent's timeline. It is evidence of presence. But the next form of evidence is of a different order entirely. It is a record not just of presence, but of organization, of shared vision, and of a human will powerful enough to reshape the earth itself. In the low, humid landscape of northeastern Louisiana, there is a place that seems to hold a quiet argument with the sky. From the ground, it can be difficult to grasp, but from above, a design of immense scale becomes clear. A series of vast, concentric earthen ridges forming a giant semicircle that once faced a now vanished river. This is not a natural formation. This is architecture made of soil. This is Poverty Point. The scale of the work is difficult to comprehend. The ridges, when first built, stood between 4 and 6 feet high, stretching for more than 11 kilometers if laid end to end. It's estimated that the people who built this place moved over 1 million cubic meters of earth. The labor was done without domesticated animals, without wheeled carts, without metal tools. It was accomplished one basket load at a time, countless journeys carrying between 50 and 60 pounds of soil, repeated millions upon millions of times. It was a collective effort, a monumental act of will sustained across generations. And here is the detail that quietly fractures the simple timeline of human progress. The people who built this landscape between roughly 3,700 and 3,100 years ago were not agriculturalists. They were a complex society of hunter-fisher-gatherers. The standard story of civilization often follows a rigid sequence. Humans first learn to farm, which creates a food surplus, which allows for settled villages, which grow into cities, which then, and only then, develop the social organization needed for monumental works. Poverty Point does not follow this script. It stands as a powerful testament to the idea that there is more than one path to complexity. The people who lived here organized their society on a massive scale, coordinating the labor of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individuals without the hierarchical structure of a state built on grain surpluses. They were also at the center of an enormous trade network. Stone for tools and ornaments was brought here from as far away as the Ohio and Tennessee River valleys, and the Appalachian foothills, hundreds of miles distant. This was a sophisticated, connected, and ambitious culture, and crucially, it was an indigenous American achievement. The ingenuity and social cohesion required to build Poverty Point arose from the people of this land. Its existence requires no external explanation, no appeal to a vanished race or a lost tradition from another continent. It is a work of indigenous American genius, a chapter in the human story that reminds us that monumentality is not the sole property of agricultural empires. It is a testament to the fact that a society can write its world view, its ceremonial calendar, and its social map directly into the earth. If a footprint can prove deep presence, a site like Poverty Point proves deep and sophisticated organization. It shows us a massive ceremonial landscape, planned and executed with a stunning clarity of vision. But this was not the final expression of this monumental impulse in North America. The next site shows us something else entirely, a true city, with a population that would have rivaled and perhaps surpassed many of the great cities of Europe at the time. If the architecture of Poverty Point was written in arcs of moved earth, then a few centuries later, and several hundred miles to the north, that same language would be used to build a city. Near the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri and Illinois rivers, across from modern-day St. Louis, a great earthen pyramid rises from the floodplain. This is Monk's Mound, the heart of the ancient city of Cahokia. To grasp its scale, we need an anchor from the other side of the world. The base of Monk's Mound is larger than that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built by indigenous peoples of the Mississippian culture, one basket load of earth at a time, over a period of centuries. At its peak, around the year 1100 AD, Cahokia was a sprawling urban centre, home to as many as 20,000 people. It was surrounded by more than 120 other mounds of various sizes and functions, some topped with temples or elite residences, others used for burials. A vast 500-acre grand plaza, levelled and planned, served as the city's civic and ceremonial core. Its trade network was continental, bringing copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica from the southern Appalachians. This was, for a time, the largest city north of Mexico, a true centre of power, belief, and culture. And yet, for many people, its existence is a surprise. The fact that a city of this scale can fade so completely from popular memory is a powerful lesson in itself. Part of the reason is material. Stone ruins leave jagged silhouettes against the sky, demanding attention. An earthen city, when abandoned, softens. Its edges blur, its slopes grass over, slowly returning to the landscape from which they were raised. But this forgetting was not just a natural process. It was amplified by a historical narrative that struggled to see and value the complexity of indigenous societies. Cahokia's story is not a mystery of a vanished race. It is a testament to a vast, complex urban world built by the ancestors of modern Native Americans. It challenges any simple story of what a city must look like and who was capable of building one. This great centre of population and ceremony was not an island. It was connected to its world by rivers, trade, and belief. But in another part of the continent, a different kind of society would write its memory into the landscape, not just with pyramids of earth, but with lines stretching across the desert. From a city of earth, we now travel west and back in time, into the high desert of New Mexico, to a place of monumental stone. Here, in the wide, sun-bleached basin of Chaco Canyon, we find our final American example, not of a single footprint, nor a single city, but of an entire region organized around a sacred idea. Between roughly 850 and 1250 AD, a remarkable cultural expression flourished here, leaving behind some of the most sophisticated architecture in ancient North America. The great houses of Chaco are not simple villages. They are vast, pre-planned stone complexes, some rising 4 or 5 stories and containing hundreds of interconnected rooms. The largest, Pueblo Bonito, is a sweeping D-shaped structure that grew over 3 centuries to become the ceremonial heart of a civilization. The masonry is astonishing, evolving through time from simple walls to intricate core and veneer constructions, with distinctive, beautiful patterns. This was not a city that grew organically, like a tangled vine. It feels more like a carefully designed university campus or a great monastic centre, a place people journey to for ceremony, knowledge, and trade, rather than a dense hub of daily life. But the true scale of the Chacoan world only becomes visible when you look beyond the canyon walls. Radiating outwards from this centre is a network of engineered roads, some stretching for hundreds of miles across the landscape. These are not wandering footpaths. They are often perfectly straight, up to 30 feet wide, and constructed with ramps and stairways cut into bedrock to maintain their direct lines over cliffs and mesas. Many of these roads do not seem to connect practical resources. Instead, they appear to link Chaco to other great houses and sacred points in the terrain, forming a web of movement that was as much ritual as it was transport. This was a society mapping its cosmos onto the land itself. The great houses are aligned with solar and lunar events. At Fachada Butte, which rises at the canyon's entrance, a spiral petroglyph known as the Sun Dagger was famously used to track the solstices and equinoxes, marked by a precise sliver of light passing through carefully positioned rock slabs. This entire basin was a coordinated system, a sacred geography where architecture, astronomy, and landscape were woven into one. This achievement belongs entirely to the ancestral Puebloan peoples, whose descendants, the modern Pueblo nations of New Mexico and Arizona, carry the memory and heritage of this place. Chaco shows us that the impulse to create monumental order, to align stone with the sky, to build a center that organizes a vast landscape, is not a singular event in human history. It is a recurring pattern. The questions we ask of Giza are not so different from the questions we can ask here. What kind of society coordinated this effort? What system of belief made these alignments meaningful? Having now seen how deep time and complexity are written into the American landscape, we can return to our global story and turn from the visible traces left in stone and earth to the invisible inheritance that survives in our own biology. После путешествия по дорогам и городам из камня и земли мы поворачиваемся к самому тонкому архиву из всех, тому, что записано в человеческой ДНК. В последние десятилетия генетики, изучающие глубокую историю наших предков, столкнулись с интригующим феноменом, который они называют «призрачными популяциями». Это не мистический термин, это строгий научный вывод. Представьте, что вы составляете огромное семейное древо, используя генетические данные тысяч людей, как древних, так и современных. Вы можете видеть, как одни ветви соединяются с другими, образуя кластеры родства. Но иногда, чтобы объяснить генетический состав двух или более известных групп, математические модели требуют существования третьей, более древней ветви, предковой группы, которая должна была существовать, чтобы связать их воедино. Однако прямых образцов этой группы, костей, из которых можно было бы извлечь ДНК, в руках ученых нет. Это и есть призрачная популяция. Это недостающее звено, чье существование выведено из следов, которые оно оставило в геномах своих потомков. Самый известный пример – это линия, которую ученые называют базальными евразийцами. При изучении древней ДНК первых земледельцев Ближнего Востока исследователи обнаружили, что значительная часть их генома происходит от этой глубокой, призрачной ветви человечества. Эта линия, по-видимому, отделилась от всех других неафриканских популяций очень давно, еще до того, как те разделились между собой. Мы можем видеть их генетическое эхо в людях, которые жили тысячи лет спустя, но самих базальных евразийцев как археологическую культуру мы еще не нашли. Это реальный научный способ, которым мы можем обнаружить присутствие давно исчезнувшей группы людей. Но здесь крайне важна интеллектуальная дисциплина. Обнаружение генетического призрака — это не то же самое, что обнаружение затерянной цивилизации строителей. Генетический сигнал — это не культурная биография. Он ничего не говорит нам о том, какие инструменты использовала эта популяция, каким богам она поклонялась или какие сооружения она возводила. Это доказательство родства, а не технологии. Тем не менее, существование призрачных популяций — это еще одно мощное напоминание о том, насколько неполна наша летопись. Это подтверждает, что человеческая история гораздо богаче и сложнее, чем можно судить по найденным костям и камням. Целые ветви человеческой семьи могли существовать, процветать и исчезать, оставляя после себя лишь едва уловимые отголоски в нашей ДНК. Это еще один механизм забвения, но также и удивительный механизм памяти. И это подводит нас к последнему, самому суровому вопросу. Если целые популяции могут исчезнуть из археологической летописи, оставив лишь призрачные следы, какие события, какие силы природы или истории способны стереть миры почти до чисто? If the threads of ancestry can be lost and entire cities of Earth can fade from memory, what kind of event could sever the connection to a deeper past on a much larger scale? This question leads us to one of the most compelling and debated ideas in modern Earth science. Around 12,900 years ago, something dramatic happened to the planet's climate. Just as the world was warming, emerging from the grip of the last ice age, temperatures suddenly plunged back into glacial cold. This period, known as the Younger Dryas, lasted for over 1,000 years. It was an abrupt, shocking reversal. To explain this sudden freeze, a controversial but powerful idea was proposed, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This theory suggests that one or more fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the Earth or exploded in its atmosphere, triggering continent-spanning wildfires, darkening the sky, and causing the northern ice sheets to melt catastrophically. The sudden flood of fresh water into the Atlantic would have disrupted the ocean currents that carry heat around the globe, plunging the world back into a harsh winter. Proponents of the hypothesis point to a thin layer in the sediment from that time, a layer containing microscopic diamonds, glassy spherules, and other materials they argue are the chemical fingerprints of a cosmic impact. However, the hypothesis remains highly debated within the scientific community. Many other researchers have reported difficulty in replicating these findings consistently across different sites. They argue that the materials found are not uniquely a sign of an impact and could have been formed by other terrestrial processes. This is not a sign of failure, but a sign of science working as intended. A bold claim requires extraordinary evidence, and that evidence is subjected to intense, rigorous scrutiny. But here, we can make a crucial turn. We do not need to accept the impact hypothesis as settled fact to understand the profound importance of the Younger Dryas. The debate is about the trigger, not the event. The climate records are clear. The world our ancestors lived in at the end of the Ice Age was not a place of slow, gentle change. It was a world of abrupt, violent swings, where the fundamental conditions for life could change dramatically, not over millennia, but within the span of a few generations. Whether caused by a cosmic event or by the complex internal mechanics of a warming planet, the result was the same: a period of immense stress for any human populations living through it. The true lesson from the Younger Dryas is not about the certainty of a single explosive catastrophe. It is about the reality of environmental instability. The world that sits just behind our own recorded history was volatile, and this volatility itself is a mechanism of forgetting, a force that could easily fragment cultures, erase landscapes, and sever the lines of memory. We have walked through many landscapes. We have stood before a weathered wall of limestone, a stone surface that seems to hold a memory of a different climate. We have read the words of a king who gained his power by uncovering a monument already ancient in his own time. We have followed the path of invisible particles through the heart of the Great Pyramid, revealing silent, unknown spaces within its structure. Archaeology is sometimes like trying to reconstruct a vast and complex library, burned in a fire from a handful of surviving pages. You cannot read the entire story, but from the fragments you can sense its scope, its language, its ambition. We have a page written in geology, from the enclosure of the Sphinx. We have a page of royal memory, from the stela of a pharaoh. We have a page from modern physics showing a map of voids. We have pages from deep time, from the hunter-gatherer monuments at Göbekli Tepe and the earthwork cities built by indigenous peoples in the Americas. We have pages that were torn from the book by nature itself, the 120 meters of drowned coastline where entire worlds may have existed and vanished. And we have a final, faint trace, written into our own biology, the genetic signature of ghost populations, the mathematical shadow of lost branches on the human family tree. None of these fragments, by itself, proves a single, coherent story of a lost global civilization. They cannot be stitched together into a simple answer. But when you lay these surviving pages side by side, a powerful pattern begins to emerge. It is a pattern of underestimation, a pattern that suggests human ambition, organization, and monumental expression are far older and have been more cyclical than the simple story of linear progress we often tell ourselves. It speaks not of an unbroken ascent, but of cycles of rise and fall and partial inheritance. It suggests a past where great things were accomplished, and then, for reasons we can only guess at, profoundly forgotten. The work, then, is not to invent what was written on the missing pages. It is to feel the true weight of their absence, to understand that what we call history is not the complete story, but merely the collection of what happened to survive. And in these surviving fragments, we can sense a human past more complex, more fragile, and perhaps more tragic than the one we thought we knew. The real mystery is not what might be hidden in the gaps. It is the scale of the gaps themselves. With this sense of a wider, more fragmented inheritance, let us return, one last time, to the Giza Plateau. And so, after our long journey through stone and text, across submerged coastlines and forgotten landscapes, we return to Giza. The Great Pyramid still stands, a silent triangle against the sky, indifferent to all our questions. An object can appear different depending on the light that strikes it. In the flat light of midday, a mountain is just a mass of rock, but at dawn, that same mountain becomes a canvas of shadow and colour, revealing textures and forms that were invisible moments before. The Great Pyramid is such an object. Throughout our investigation, we have viewed it in many different lights, and each has shown us a different face. In one light, the archaeological light, it is a tomb, the apex of a royal funerary complex built for a king of the 4th dynasty, surrounded by the graves of his family and officials, supported by the clear evidence of his administration's logistics. In another light, the engineer's light, it is a masterpiece of applied physics and human organization, a mountain of quarried limestone and granite aligned to the cardinal points of the planet with a precision that remains astonishing. In a third light, the celestial light, it becomes a model of the cosmos. Its geometry reflects sacred proportions, its shafts map the paths of stars, and its very presence on the plateau establishes a zone of divine order on Earth. And in a fourth, more ancient light, the light of myth, it is the first time made stone, the benben, the primeval mound rising from the dark, chaotic waters of creation, a physical anchor for the moment the world began. It is a monument that does not just occupy a place, but creates it. The pyramid does not have to be only one of these things. Perhaps the impulse to force a single identity onto it, to declare it either a tomb or a machine, either a local dynastic project or the relic of a lost global age, is the very thing that limits our understanding. The demand for a simple answer, a single label, diminishes the object itself. Its true endurance as a mystery comes from its capacity to hold all of these truths at once. It is not a riddle waiting for a final victorious word. It is a monument that becomes richer, more profound, and more alive the more layers of meaning we can see coexisting within its form. The mystery is not that we have the wrong answer, it is that we may be asking too small a question. To conclude this investigation with the honesty it deserves, let us draw a clear line between what is established, what is debated, and what remains open to our sense of wonder. After this long walk through stone, and text, and time, it is worth pausing before we leave the landscape. It is worth separating the layers of evidence we have explored, not to close the case, but to understand its shape. If this investigation were a legal proceeding, we would find that the evidence falls into different categories of certainty. Some things are known, established beyond a reasonable doubt. Others are debated, like contested testimony from credible but conflicting witnesses. And a great deal is interpretive, powerful, compelling, but ultimately circumstantial, speaking to meaning rather than fact. First, what is known? It is a known fact, supported by a convergence of evidence, that the Giza plateau was the site of immense construction projects during the Old Kingdom of Egypt. The administrative records from Wadi al-Jarf, the diary of an inspector named Mera, describe the transport of limestone for the Great Pyramid during the reign of Khufu. Quarry marks bearing his name are found inside the relieving chambers, sealed from view for millennia. The entire site, its causeways, its temples, its cemeteries for workers and officials, is woven into the fabric of the 4th dynasty. To erase this evidence would be to ignore the testimony of the Egyptians themselves. It is also known, as a matter of direct physical measurement, that previously undetected spaces exist within the Great Pyramid. The Scan Pyramids project, using muon radiography, has confirmed the presence of the Big Void and the North Face Corridor. These are not theories, they are measured absences in the stone. Their function, however, remains unknown. And it is known that human beings were present in North America during the height of the last ice age. The footprints at White Sands are not a story but a physical trace, a series of moments preserved in ancient mud, pushing back the timeline of human presence on that continent. These things form the bedrock of our inquiry. Then, there is what is genuinely debated. The age of the Great Sphinx is the most prominent example. The debate is not between science and dogma, but between different scientific disciplines reading the same object. On one side, there is the archaeological context, which connects the Sphinx and its temple to the quarrying and construction sequence of Khafra's pyramid complex. On the other, there is the geological interpretation, which argues that the deep vertical weathering on the enclosure walls speaks of prolonged exposure to rainfall, in a climate that largely vanished from Giza thousands of years before Khafre. Both sides present evidence. Both sides have qualified experts. The question remains open because the stone itself holds conflicting stories. The story of how it was cut and the story of how it has decayed. Likewise, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is a subject of intense scientific debate. The period itself, a time of abrupt and severe climate disruption, is well established. But whether a cosmic impact was the trigger is a question still being argued, with evidence presented and contested. To state it as fact would be to ignore the ongoing work of science. Finally, there is the interpretive layer, where most of the meaning we seek resides. The model of inheritance we have explored is interpretive. It is a way of holding all the evidence at once: the Old Kingdom construction, the anomalous weathering, the texts of restoration, the theme of a first time, without forcing one piece to cancel another. It suggests the pyramids can be both Egyptian and the inheritors of a deeper memory of landscape and cosmos. The idea that the Great Pyramid's geometry encodes specific mathematical constants or astronomical knowledge is also interpretive. The patterns are real, the ratios can be calculated, but whether they were intentionally encoded as a message is a question of design, not just measurement. And the connection between global flood myths and the very real, geologically proven rise in post-glacial sea levels is interpretive. It is a powerful resonance, a way to wonder if the trauma of a changing world, of coastlines that moved within the span of generations, could survive as a story, carried like a cultural gene. Drawing these lines does not diminish the mystery, it protects it. It allows us to stand in awe of the genuinely known, the scale of Old Kingdom logistics, the precision of indigenous American earthworks. It allows us to follow the genuinely debated questions with respect for the process, understanding that a living question is more valuable than a premature answer, and it gives us permission to explore the interpretive possibilities with intellectual freedom, because we are no longer afraid of confusing a beautiful idea with a proven fact. The most honest and profound relationship we can have with the deep past is one that honors the boundaries of our knowledge. This is not a failure of imagination. It is an act of respect that allows the real wonder to endure. With this clarity, we can return to the physical world, to the things that remain when the arguments fade. We end where we began, at the foot of a limestone wall here in the enclosure of the Sphinx. The low sun catches the deep vertical grooves, the rounded ledges, the scarred face of the bedrock. This is the surface that launched our investigation, a page of stone that seems to hold a memory of a different climate, a different world. It does not offer a simple answer. It offers a better thing, a question that has outlasted generations of argument. It is an anchor, a place to begin, and a place to return. From this solid wall, the investigation moves to an image of pure absence, a dark shape on a scientist's screen, a measured void of at least 30 meters hanging in the digital silence above the Grand Gallery. This is the ghost revealed by muons, the particles that fall from space. We cannot walk inside it. We cannot touch its walls. We can only know that it is there, an empty space, a question mark, held in the heart of the most studied monument on Earth. It is a reminder that even stone can contain an emptiness that we have yet to understand. Then, the view pulls back and further back, until the land itself disappears. We are looking down at a coastline that no longer exists, a continental shelf now covered by 120 meters of cold, dark water. Down there, sealed beneath the pressure and the sediment, are the landscapes where people once walked, hunted, and lived. River mouths, coastal plains, gentle shores. We cannot excavate them easily. We cannot know what was lost. We only know that the map of the ancient world is not the one we see today. The ground itself has been taken away, and with it, an unknown portion of the human story. It is a form of forgetting caused not by a failure of memory, but by the slow, relentless rising of the sea. And from that immense planetary scale of loss, the focus comes down to the smallest, most intimate trace imaginable. A single footprint, pressed into the mud of a lakeside in what is now New Mexico, more than 21,000 years ago. The curve of a heel, the press of a toe, the weight of a human body moving through a world of giant sloths and mammoths. This is not a monument. It is not a text. It is the simple, undeniable proof of presence. A fleeting moment, captured by geological chance, that quietly rearranged the timeline of a continent. A reminder that the deepest history is not always written in stone architecture, but in the earth we walk upon. These are the things that survive. The weathered face of a wall, a measured void inside a pyramid, a drowned coastline on a map of the ancient sea, a footprint in the mud of the last ice age. The people themselves are gone. Their languages are silent. The precise shape of their beliefs, the reasons for their journeys, the names they called their children. Most of this is lost. It was written on materials that could not last. It was spoken into the air. It was carried in mines that have long since returned to dust. What remains is what the stone, the water, and the earth allowed to remain. The story of humanity is not a continuous, unbroken library of triumphs. It is an archipelago of islands, fragments of evidence that have survived the long ocean of time and forgetting. The final question, then, is not whether we have found a single definitive answer to the mystery of a lost golden age. The question is quieter and perhaps more profound. How much of our own story do we fail to see, simply because we are looking only at the islands and not at the ocean of what has been lost in between?